There are times that games take so much out of a company that the company just can't exist anymore. Hi folks, it's Falcon, and today on gameranx, 10 games that ruined game companies. Starting off with number 10, it's 007 Legends by Eurocom. Eurocom's mostly known for licensed games, and they were one of the most prolific British video game developers of the 1990s all the way through to the 2000s. And while not every single one of their games is incredible or anything, they made a few really good James Bond games like James Bond 007 Nightfire for consoles, and they also made Dead Space Extraction, so they definitely deserve some respect for that. 007 Legends, however, ain't that great. The game's release was scheduled to coincide with the 50th anniversary of the James Bond movies, and if you know anything about Sonic games, like specifically Sonic 06, you know trying to tie games to an anniversary date is not a good idea. Going based on this game, that curse is clearly not exclusive to Sonic. The basic idea of the game was that it was going to be a celebration of the entire movie series. So each section of the game would recreate certain sections of the movie, but it was kind of a mess. It couldn't just be a compilation of different eras of James Bond. For some reason, it had to be a tie-in to the most recent movie, Skyfall. And so the whole thing's presented like these are all past adventures of the Daniel Craig James Bond, which kind of is weird. Every James Bond kind of exists in a different era, in a different universe even, and just seeing Craig in the old movies is weird enough, especially when they managed to get some of the likeness rights to the characters of the previous movies, but not all of them. So the whole celebration aspect of the game's kind of a mess, and the gameplay isn't a lot better. The controls are solid enough, but the whole thing ends up feeling like a third-rate Call of Duty knockoff without any of the personality or charm that a James Bond game should have. The craziest thing about it is the ending, like, you know, the final mission. It wasn't on the disc. It was made available as a free download after Skyfall came out. The only one that had the complete story on the disc was the Wii U version, so no surprise here. The game was panned by critics and did not do well commercially. Eurocom ended up closing its doors only about 2 months later. It's a shame, too. Eurocom was a pretty consistently solid developer, and the idea for 007 Legends was not a bad one. It was actually pretty good. It was just that development issues killed this game and took down the developers with it. And number 9 is Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning by 38 Studios, a famous one that is unusual because the actual game isn't bad. When it comes to killing companies, games don't actually have to be bad or even really sell poorly for the developer to still croak. There are a lot of factors when it comes to killing companies, and this one had them. Here, the factor was World Series baseball pitcher Curt Schilling and the state of Rhode Island. Basically, Curt Schilling was burning through money at the studio, investing around $35 million of his own money before making a deal with Rhode Island to move the studio there in exchange for a $75 million loan, which was a hell of a lot of money for a studio that just had no history to speak of. There was game development experience there, though. 38 Studios brought in big, huge games. The guys who made Rise of Nations, one of the all-time great RTS games, and adapted the game that they were already working on to the Amalur universe. That's probably the main reason a game actually came out. 38's previous work on an MLR MMO never got anywhere. When the game came out in 2012, it got decent reviews and sold relatively well, especially for a new property, but it wasn't nearly enough to pay back the debt they owed Rhode Island. The whole thing ended up being a huge scandal, in part because all the money that was lost came from state taxpayers. $75 million is kind of a lot of money to just go up and smoke, and people wanted heads to roll. It's a story where the actual game is almost immaterial. Like, the game would have needed to sell around 3 million copies to make good on that, and that just wasn't going to happen. I'm really only scratching the surface on this story, but long story short, the entire staff at 38 got laid off a few months later, and that was it. And number 8 is Tomb Raider: Angel of Darkness from Core Design. The 2000s were rough for a lot of game developers out of there. The increasing complexity of games, the rising cost of production, the larger teams that were necessary to make these games really wreaked havoc on certain developers. So many classic developers just died in this era, Core Design among them. These guys have been making games since the late 80s, but in 1996, they hit it really big with Tomb Raider. If you know video games, you probably know Tomb Raider. It was incredibly popular for a while and spawned a ton of sequels, all made by Core. They somehow managed to pump out 6 mainline Tomb Raider games between 96 and 2003, literally a game a year until Angel of Darkness, which saw multiple delays before its eventual release in 2003. it was pretty clear that the team of Core was stretched pretty thin with all these sequels. Like, they were really hitting diminishing returns after the third game. So when the next generation came around, they weren't really ready for it. It's one of those games that just feels incomplete from the start. The controls feel a generation behind, the game's plagued with bugs, and the whole thing feels half finished. There's story elements that go nowhere, gameplay mechanics that get introduced and don't do anything. It's a mess. After the game's failure, the Tomb Raider franchise was handed over to Crystal Dynamics, and while Core didn't close down immediately, it never really worked on a major game again. In 2006, they were sold and renamed Rebellion Derby, and were finally taken out to the shed and shot in 2010. And number 7 is Haze from Free Radical Design, the Halo killer. Is there a more cursed thing to try to be in gaming? There were a lot of games really chasing the Halo crown in the mid-2000s, but for whatever reason, nothing ever even got close. You'd think a studio like Free Radical Design, the guys behind the fantastic Timesplitter series, would be able to keep the streak going with this one. That did not happen. Like a lot of games on this list, the idea is not, like, terrible or anything. You play as a mercenary that sees the world like a video game, but the reality is supposed to be much uglier. It's an interesting concept that the game does almost nothing with, and ends up being forgettable as just kind of a dull FPS with a few gimmicks. There's just nothing particularly good about it. It's sluggish, story's laughable, and the multiplayer is just a total flatline. So, just nothing compared to Halo. Like Core Design, the studio kind of hobbled on for a while. They sold themselves to Crytek and were called Crytek UK for a while, but that didn't last. In 2014, most of the staff was laid off, unfortunately. You'd think that'd be the end of it, but in 2021, Deep Silver brought them back, but nothing has been announced, so all we can do is hope that they do Timesplitters 4 rather than Haze 2. And number 6 is Daikatana by Ion Storm. Formed in 1996, Ion Storm was supposed to be like the Image comics of the video game world. A place where superstar creators could work on the games they wanted to make. They had names like John Romero, Tom Hall, Warren Spector, and they did manage to put out a major classic, Deus Ex, and one cult classic, Gameranx, which was actually kind of a JRPG, but made by Ion Storm. They also made Daikatana, probably one of the most infamous video games of its era, as one of the biggest flops of any era. The game's terrible. It's a frustrating and miserable slog that gets a little better in the later levels, but has one of the worst missions of any game ever made. How John Romero made this after working on Doom, I don't know. Doom is still like tons of fun to play even right now, and this game is terrible. I don't know why anyone would want to play an entire game that's an escort mission. Originally supposed to come out in Christmas '97, but it took until spring of 2000 before the game actually came out, and it was just a joke by then. The ad campaign also really didn't help. It had probably one of the most embarrassing ads of all time that simply said, "John Romero is about to make you his bitch," in big letters with an extra "suck it down" for good measure. Ion Storm kept going to produce the Deus Ex sequel and Thief 3, but after closing out a 6-game contract they had with Eidos, they were shut down in 2005. And number 5 is Nier and Kavia. Kavia was one of those weird Japanese companies that made a lot of weird games, but never really managed to find a breakout hit, kind of like From Software, if they hadn't made Demon Souls. Best known for the Drakengard franchise, published by Square Enix. Their games had this idiosyncratic edge to them that made them interesting, even if they didn't really accomplish what they set out to do gameplay-wise. Which leads us to Nier, a game that is considered a postmodern classic today, but in 2010 when it first came out, it got very middling reviews and only had decent sales. The game was supposed to be really big, basically Square Enix's answer to Legend of Zelda. There was also a pretty clear attempt to try to cater to the Western market with this one. Like, they changed the main character to a middle-aged muscle man in the West compared to the pretty boy you play as in the Japanese version, but the game was just too weird to ever find a lot of mainstream success, especially in 2010. So after the failure of this game, Kavia was officially disbanded. In most cases, the story actually would end there, but against all odds, a sequel to Nier came out in 2017, developed by Platinum Games, that is just as weird as the original, but it was a breakout hit, shipping over 6.5 million copies worldwide. So while Kavia is dead, Nier absolutely lives on. At number 4 is BMX XXX by Acclaim. Now, we're normally talking mostly about developers here in this video. It's rare that an entire publisher goes down because of a single bad game, and while that's not necessarily the case with Acclaim exactly, it's easy to chart their demise by looking at the truly wretched BMX XXX. The early 2000s were an absolute wasteland of extreme sports games chasing after the Tony Hawk money. Few of them actually managed to stand out, so I guess Acclaim decided that sexing up their Dave Mirra BMX games would get some attention. They were working under the assumption that any press is good press, and that ended up not really being the case, because Dave Mirra sued to get his name taken off the game. Game stores refused to sell it, and game press were dismissive of it from the very start. It got bad reviews, it sold terribly, and damaged the reputation of the company in the process. It took a couple more high-profile failures to actually kill Acclaim. Turok Evolution really flopped hard, and their attempt at a platformer, really fell flat on its face. Remember Vex in 2004? If you were around for that, ooh. They were burning through money really quick though, and the games were not selling, so they finally closed in August of 2004. The games just weren't any good, that's the problem, and seemingly nonstop controversies that the company was generating didn't do much to endear them to the people either. Seriously, if you haven't heard about all the dumb stuff that Acclaim did, look it up. Some of the marketing stunts that they pulled were just totally insane. Like when Burnout 2 came out, they offered to reimburse any driver in the UK who got a speeding ticket, basically encouraging people to break the law. At number 3 is APB, All Points Bulletin, Real-Time Worlds. The original Crackdown on the Xbox was a great game. Sure, most people got it just to play the Halo 3 multiplayer beta, but that doesn't mean it was not a great game. It was. Developed by Dundee, Scotland-based Real-Time Worlds and published by Microsoft, was a really impressive first game. Most people expected the studio to have a long and fruitful future ahead of it. They could have just made a sequel, but instead they decided to think big. All Points Bulletin was supposed to be this massive cops and robbers MMO, basically GTA Online nearly a decade earlier. It was really ambitious, and it had a massive $100 million development cost. But if you played the game, you'd have no idea that it cost that much to make. Because what came out was a really bare bones, barely there multiplayer experience that was not interesting enough to hold someone's attention for an afternoon, let alone a month's subscription time. Yeah, it had subscriptions like any other MMO at the time. It came out in June 2010, and by August, Real-Time Worlds was placed into administration. It barely lasted 3 months. APB is somehow still running, though, even today, and it is as dull today as it was then. And number 2 is Radical Heights from Boss Key Productions. For a while, few names in gaming were big as Cliff Bleszinski or Cliffy B. He was at the top of the world for the Gears of War games, but for whatever reason, he decided to step away and go indie with disastrous results. The first failure was Lawbreakers, a actually pretty cool looking arena shooter that came out in 2017. Everything about it was pretty good except for one fatal mistake. They made an arena shooter in 2017, so it really just did not stand a chance. So in response, it went the exact opposite direction. Now they were going to chase trends hard and made Radical Heights a blatant Fortnite ripoff with some 80s theming that made it stand out a little. It could have even worked if they didn't rush it out the door so quickly. Even for an early access game, Radical Heights, it felt rough. Forget beta, this was not even an alpha. Even at the time, people saw the game as a desperate attempt to keep the lights on. If they had secured funding and maybe waited a few more months to iron out some of the issues, it maybe could have worked, but what came out just wasn't any good. It was released on Steam Early Access in April 2018, and only a month later, on May 14th, 2018, Cliffy B announced the studio was closing, which actually caught a lot of its employees by surprise because he did it on Twitter rather than inside the studio, to them. Did it publicly. In less than a year, Bleszinski went from one of the most respected game developers out there to a punchline, and almost all of that comes from the colossal failure of Radical Heights. At number 1 is Too Human and X-Men Destiny from Silicon Knights. This was a developer that you had to watch out for in the 2000s. They had games like Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem. They remade Metal Gear Solid, the original one, as the Twin Snakes for GameCube, and it was really well received, if not with some quirks. But even now, Eternal Darkness is considered a cult classic among horror fans, and was just an all-around well-made game. They did great on GameCube, but when they switched over to Xbox 360, the cracks started to show. Released in 2008, Too Human is a weird, not very good game that's also really short, too short for what it was. And if that was all that was wrong with it, though, Silicon Knights would probably still be around. The problem is the game, it was not just mediocre, it actually used stolen code. Like, seriously. In one of the most epic moments of self-sabotage ever, Silicon Knights sued Epic Games, the creators of the Unreal Engine, which they were using for Too Human alongside other games that they had in development. They basically accused Epic of poor support, not giving them proper documentation, and missing a deadline to provide the full version of the engine. That ended up backfiring hard when Epic countersued them for copyright infringement, providing evidence that they'd stolen their code and tried to pass it off as their own. Epic won its countersuit for $4.45 million, and Silicon Knights was forced to recall other games that used the Unreal Engine. So Too Human and their last game, the terrible X-Men, had to be destroyed and removed from online storefronts. Like, they're still easy to get games these days, but the damage was done. 2 years later, in 2014, Silicon Knights filed for bankruptcy, and when they tried to make a comeback with a spiritual successor to Eternal Darkness, the failure of those campaigns pretty much closed the book on them. And that's all for today. Leave us a comment, let us know what you think. If you like this video, click like. If you're not subscribed, now's a great time to do so. We upload brand new videos every day of the week. Best way to see them first is, of course, a subscription, so click subscribe. Don't forget to enable notifications, and as always, thank you very much for watching this video. I'm Falcon. You can follow me on Twitter @FalconTheHero, and we'll see you next time right here on gameranx.